The blood-red sunset painted the Montana sky as Zachariah Zimmerman buried his son beneath the lone oak tree. 6 feet of unforgiving earth now separated him from the only family he had left in this world. His calloused hands gripped the shovel until his knuckles turned white, the pain in his fingers nothing compared to the hollow ache consuming his chest. Montana Territory, 1876. The land was as beautiful as it was brutal. The small wooden cross bore only 2 words: Samuel Zimmerman, no dates. No epitaph. Nothing to indicate that just last week the boy had turned 7, that he could ride almost as well as his father, that his laughter had been the only thing keeping Zachariah sane since his wife Mary had died birthing him. Fever had taken Samuel. A simple, common fever that had burned through the boy's small body like wildfire through dry brush. 3 days of helplessly watching his son waste away, 3 nights of praying to a God he wasn't sure existed anymore. Zachariah drove the shovel into the dirt beside the grave and stood motionless, his shadow stretching long across the newly disturbed earth. The wind whipped his dark hair across his face, but he made no move to brush it away. At 32, the lines around his eyes spoke of a man who'd lived far longer. "I'm sorry, Sammy," he whispered, the words immediately snatched away by the wind. "I failed you." His small homestead looked empty as he approached. The cabin he'd built with his own hands 5 years ago stood silent, the front door slightly ajar from his hasty exit when he'd carried his son's body out for burial. The 2 horses in the corral nickered softly as he passed, but Zachariah couldn't bring himself to acknowledge them. Inside, the cabin was cold. The fire had died hours ago while he'd been digging. Samuel's small bed in the corner was stripped bare, the sheets already boiled and hanging stiffly outside. His toys, a wooden horse Zachariah had carved, a small tin soldier a passing traveler had gifted him, sat untouched on the table. Zachariah moved mechanically, stoking the fire back to life. The routine tasks kept his hands busy while his mind reeled. Tomorrow he would need to ride into town. The ranch couldn't run itself. They needed supplies. They needed he caught himself. There was no they anymore, just him. He slumped into a chair at the table, his fingers finding the small wooden horse. Samuel had named it Thunder, for the sound its hooves would make when he galloped it across the floor. That night, Zachariah didn't sleep. He sat by the fire until it died down to embers, then rekindled it again. When dawn broke, he was still sitting there, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. The town of Silveridge was a half-day's ride from the Zimmerman ranch. It wasn't much a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments serving the scattered ranches and farms of the area. Most days, Zachariah avoided town unless absolutely necessary, preferring the solitude of his land. Today, he had no choice. He needed flour, coffee, and ammunition. The supplies wouldn't buy themselves. The general store was run by Walter Green, a portly man with perpetually ink-stained fingers from counting his inventory. As Zachariah entered, the little bell above the door announcing his arrival, Green looked up from his ledger. "Zimmerman," he greeted, then his face fell as he remembered. News traveled fast in small towns. "I was mighty sorry to hear about your boy." Zachariah nodded curtly, handing over his list. He had no desire for pity or platitudes. "Just these," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Green busied himself gathering the items, mercifully abandoning any attempt at conversation. Zachariah stood stiffly by the counter, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. The bell above the door jingled again. Zachariah didn't look up until he heard Green's warm greeting. "Miss Redmond." "Right on time. The books you ordered came in yesterday." Zachariah glanced over despite himself. A woman he'd never seen before stood in the doorway, removing her gloves. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a dark blue dress, practical but well-made, without the excessive frills many women favored. "Thank you, Mr. Green," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "I've been looking forward to them." Green beamed at her. "I'll fetch them for you directly." "Just finishing up with Mr. Zimmerman here." The woman, Miss Redmond, turned toward Zachariah, meeting his eyes briefly. Something in her gaze made him uncomfortable, not judgment or pity, but a quiet understanding that felt too intimate from a stranger. She nodded politely and turned away to examine some bolts of fabric. "That'll be $3.42, Green said, drawing Zachariah's attention back. He paid and gathered his supplies, eager to leave the confines of the store and the woman's unsettling presence. As he reached the door, Green called after him. "Zimmerman, almost forgot. Doc Wilson asked if you'd stop by, something about paperwork for the burial." Zachariah felt his jaw tighten but nodded. More formalities, more people wanting to offer condolences he couldn't bear to hear. He stepped outside into the harsh sunlight, squinting against the sudden glare. The doctor's office was at the end of the street, a small whitewashed building with a sign proclaiming Franklin Wilson, M.D. Zachariah tied his horse to the hitching post and steeled himself before entering Dr. Wilson was at his desk, writing in a large book. He looked up as Zachariah entered, his weathered face solemn. "Zachariah," he said, standing and extending his hand. "I'm truly sorry about Samuel. I wish I could have done more." Zachariah shook the offered hand mechanically. "Green said you needed to see me about paperwork." Dr. Wilson nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Yes, just need to complete the death certificate for county records. Won't take but a moment." Zachariah remained standing. "What do you need from me?" "Just confirmation of Samuel's full name and date of birth," Wilson said, turning back to his book. "And I need your signature here." "Samuel James Zimmerman, born May 12, 1869. Wilson nodded, writing the information down. "And he passed on May 19, 1876, Zachariah supplied, his voice flat. "His 7th birthday was the 12th. Wilson's pen paused and he looked up. Don't," Zachariah cut him off. "Where do I sign?" After completing the paperwork, Zachariah left quickly, ignoring Wilson's attempts to engage him further. Outside, he stood for a moment, the bright midday sun a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He needed a drink. The Silver Dollar Saloon was already doing a brisk business despite the early hour. Cowboys, miners, and the occasional businessman filled the tables, the air thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Zachariah found a spot at the far end of the bar, away from the clusters of men engaged in boisterous conversation. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, sliding a coin across the scarred wooden surface. The first drink burned all the way down, the second less so. By the third, Zachariah was starting to feel the blessed numbness he sought. He stared into the amber liquid, letting the noise of the saloon fade into a distant hum. "Haven't seen you in here before." Zachariah looked up. A woman in a red dress with too much rouge on her cheeks smiled at him. One of the saloon girls, clearly. He'd never partaken of their services even after Mary died. "Not staying," he said shortly. Her smile didn't falter. "Everyone says that at first." She placed a hand on his arm. "I'm Darlene, and you look like you could use some company." Zachariah removed her hand from his arm. "No." The woman's smile tightened, but she shrugged. "Suit yourself, mister. Offer stands if you change your mind." She sauntered away, already scanning the room for more receptive customers. Zachariah drained his glass and signaled for another. By the time he left the saloon, the sun was beginning to set. He'd had more whiskey than he'd intended, and the ride home would be in darkness. Zachariah untied his horse, his movements slightly unsteady. The mare whickered softly, familiar enough with him to sense his altered state. "We're going home, girl," he murmured, patting her neck. As he mounted, he caught sight of someone across the street. The woman from the general store, Miss Redmond, was locking the door of a small building he hadn't noticed before. A sign above the door read, "Silveridge School." She turned, a stack of books in her arms, and began walking down the boardwalk. Zachariah watched her for a moment, struck by the solitary figure she cut against the backdrop of the town shutting down for the evening. Then he turned his horse toward home, leaving the lights of Silveridge behind. The ride back to his ranch was long and silent. The whiskey dulled the edges of his grief, but it couldn't erase the knowledge that he was returning to an empty house. As the cabin came into view, Zachariah felt a wave of dread wash over him. How many nights would he have to walk into that silence? He took care of his horse first, unsaddling her and making sure she had feed and water. The routine tasks anchored him, giving him purpose if only for a few minutes. Finally, he could delay no longer and trudged toward the dark cabin. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Samuel's toys still on the table, his small boots by the door. The quiet was oppressive. Zachariah lit a lamp and built up the fire, going through the motions mechanically. He unpacked the supplies from town, setting each item in its place with deliberate care. When everything was put away, he stood in the center of the room, suddenly at a loss. There were chores to be done. Fences to mend, cattle to check on in the morning. Life continued whether he wanted it to or not. That night, for the first time, Zachariah slept in Samuel's bed. It was too small for his frame, his feet hanging awkwardly off the end, but he curled into it nonetheless. He clutched the wooden horse in one hand as exhaustion finally claimed him. He dreamed of Mary. She stood at the edge of their property, holding Samuel's hand. Both were smiling, beckoning to him, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't reach them. The distance between them stretched impossibly until they were just specks on the horizon. Zachariah woke with tears on his face and a hollow feeling in his chest that even the worst hangover couldn't account for. The next week passed in a blur of work and whiskey. Zachariah threw himself into ranch tasks during the day, working until his muscles screamed and sweat soaked his clothes. At night, he drank until he could sleep without dreams. It wasn't living, it was existing, but it was all he could manage. He avoided town, sending one of his ranch hands, Miguel, for supplies when needed. Miguel had worked for Zachariah for 3 years, a quiet, capable man who asked no questions about his employer's reddened eyes or the empty bottles piling up. But avoidance couldn't last forever. When one of his best breeding cows developed a concerning swelling in her udder, Zachariah knew he needed Dr. Wilson's veterinary skills. The doctor treated both humans and animals in their remote area. Reluctantly, he rode into Silveridge on a humid Tuesday morning. The cow's condition his excuse, but whiskey his true destination once the animal was seen to. Dr. Wilson was thankfully professional, focusing on the cow rather than trying to engage Zachariah in conversation about Samuel. He diagnosed mastitis, provided medicine, and gave instructions for care that Zachariah absorbed with single-minded focus. With the cow tended to and stabled at the town livery until she was fit to travel, Zachariah had accomplished his task. The responsible thing would be to handle any other business in town and return to the ranch. Instead, he found himself pushing through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar just as the noon sun reached its peak. The saloon was quieter at this hour, only a few tables occupied by men nursing beers or playing cards. Zachariah claimed his now usual spot at the end of the bar and ordered whiskey. He was on his second glass when the doors swung open again. A shaft of sunlight momentarily blinded him, and when his vision cleared, he was surprised to see Miss Redmond standing just inside the entrance. She looked out of place in the dingy saloon, her simple blue dress and neat appearance a stark contrast to the roughness of the establishment. The bartender approached her with a respectful nod. "Afternoon, Miss Redmond. Same as usual?" "Yes, thank you, Jim," she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet of the room. To Zachariah's surprise, she didn't leave immediately with whatever she'd come to collect. Instead, she took a seat at a small table near the window, unfolding a newspaper she'd carried in with her. The bartender brought her a cup that steamed in the cool interior of the saloon. Coffee, Zachariah realized. She'd come for coffee. As if sensing his scrutiny, Miss Redmond glanced up, her eyes meeting his across the room. Again, there was that unsettling look of understanding, as if she could see right through him. Zachariah looked away first, turning back to his whiskey, but his curiosity got the better of him. He found his gaze drifting back to her as she sat quietly reading, occasionally sipping from her cup. It was such an incongruous sight, a respectable woman, alone in a saloon in the middle of the day, calmly reading a newspaper. When she stood to leave some time later, she nodded politely to him as she passed. Zachariah found himself nodding back, the simple social gesture feeling foreign after days of isolation. He watched through the window as she crossed the street, entering the small schoolhouse. The teacher, he realized. That explained the books Green had mentioned. Zachariah ordered another whiskey, but found it less satisfying than before. The image of Miss Redmond sitting alone with her coffee and newspaper lingered in his mind, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. 2 days later, Zachariah returned to town to collect his cow. The animal was recovering well, according to the livery stable owner, and would be fit to make the journey back to the ranch. As he led the cow out of the stable, he caught sight of a small group of children gathered outside the schoolhouse. School was letting out for the day, and Miss Redmond stood in the doorway, saying goodbye to each child individually. Zachariah paused, watching the scene from a distance. There were perhaps 15 children of varying ages, from small ones who couldn't be more than 6 to gangly teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. Samuel would have started school this fall. The thought hit Zachariah like a physical blow, and he turned away abruptly, focusing on his cow. He'd best get back to the ranch before dark, Mr. Zimmerman. The soft voice stopped him. He turned to find Miss Redmond standing a few feet away, having apparently crossed the street while he was lost in thought. "Madam," he acknowledged, tipping his hat slightly. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Green asked me to give it to you if I saw you. He said you left it behind on your last visit." Zachariah frowned, taking the package. "I don't recall." He stopped as he unwrapped it. Inside was a small tin of peppermint candies, Samuel's favorite. He must have added them to his order out of habit and then forgotten them. "Thank you," he said stiffly, pocketing the tin. Miss Redmond nodded, her eyes on his face. "I was sorry to hear about your son," she said quietly. Zachariah felt his jaw tighten. "Thank you for the delivery, Miss Redmond," he said, deliberately ignoring her condolence. He turned back to his cow, making it clear the conversation was over, but Miss Redmond didn't leave. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, her voice still soft but somehow commanding attention. "I lost my brother to fever 3 years ago. He was 9. Zachariah froze, his back to her. "I don't presume to understand your grief exactly," she continued, "but I know something of what you're feeling." He turned slowly to face her. Miss Redmond's expression was calm, her eyes steady on his. There was no pity there, no awkward sympathy, just a clear, steady gaze that acknowledged a shared experience. "I don't want to talk about it," he said finally. She nodded. "I understand, but if you ever do." She let the sentence hang unfinished between them. "Good day, Mr. Zimmerman." She walked away, her skirts swishing softly against the boardwalk. Zachariah watched her go, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. Not comfort exactly, but perhaps the smallest recognition that he wasn't entirely alone in his experience. He led his cow toward the edge of town, his mind unusually busy. Her name, he realized, he didn't even know her full name. The next morning, Zachariah woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The whiskey haze that had become his constant companion was absent, leaving behind only a mild headache and dry mouth. He went about his morning chores with a deliberate focus, checking on the recovering cow, feeding the horses, repairing a broken fence post. Physical labor had always been his refuge, the one thing he could control when everything else spiraled beyond his grasp. As he worked, he found his thoughts returning to Miss Redmond. Her comment about her brother had caught him off guard. It wasn't the shared grief that intrigued him. Many people had lost loved ones, especially children, in this harsh country. It was her directness, the way she'd offered the information without using it to demand reciprocity or emotional connection. She'd lost her brother. She understood something of what he felt. And then she'd walked away, expecting nothing. By midday, Zachariah had made a decision. He would go into town again, ostensibly to check on supplies at the general store. If he happened to see Miss Redmond, he might thank her properly for delivering the forgotten candies. He cleaned up, changing his sweat-soaked shirt for a fresh one and trimming his beard, which had grown wild over the past weeks. Looking in the small mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized himself. His eyes were hollow, with dark circles beneath them, and new lines had etched themselves around his mouth. Silveridge was busy when he arrived, wagons and horses lining the main street. Zachariah remembered it was Friday market day, when farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area came to town to sell their goods. He made his way to the general store first, picking up a few items he didn't really need just to justify the trip. Green was busy with other customers, allowing Zachariah to avoid conversation beyond the necessary transaction. Outside, he hesitated. The schoolhouse was just down the street. Would Miss Redmond be teaching on market day? He found himself walking in that direction before he'd fully decided. The schoolhouse door was open, but the room appeared empty when he glanced inside. Zachariah was about to turn away when movement caught his eye. Miss Redmond was at the back of the room, writing something on the blackboard. He cleared his throat and she turned, surprise crossing her face when she saw him. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, setting down the chalk and wiping her hands on a small cloth. "This is unexpected." Zachariah shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he hadn't thought through what he would actually say to her. "I wanted to thank you properly for delivering that package," she smiled slightly. "It was no trouble." An awkward silence fell between them. Zachariah glanced around the schoolroom, taking in the neat rows of desks, the maps on the walls, the small bookshelf in the corner. "You have classes today?" he asked, grasping for conversation. "Not formal lessons," she replied. "Some of the children come in on market days while their parents conduct business. I provide activities to keep them occupied." As if on cue, the sound of children's voices floated in through the open door. A moment later, 3 young girls and a boy entered, carrying small baskets. "Miss Redmond, look what my ma let me bring for lunch," one of the girls exclaimed, holding up her basket. Miss Redmond smiled warmly at the children. "That looks wonderful, Emily. Why don't you all set up at the back table? I'll be with you in a moment." The children eyed Zachariah curiously, but did as they were told, moving to a table at the rear of the room. "I should go," Zachariah said, already backing toward the door. "Of course," Miss Redmond replied, but then she added, "My first name is Hannah, by the way, Hannah Redmond." Zachariah paused. "Zachariah Zimmerman," he offered in return, though she likely already knew his name. "I know," she said with a small smile. "It's a small town, Mr. Zimmerman," he nodded, oddly comforted by the fact that she'd used his surname despite offering her own first name. It maintained a distance that felt safer somehow. "Good day, Miss Redmond," he said, tipping his hat slightly before turning to leave. "Mr. Zimmerman," she called after him, her voice lowered so the children wouldn't hear. "I'm usually at the Silver Dollar around noon most days." "For coffee," she clarified quickly, "if you'd ever like company." Zachariah looked back at her, surprised by the invitation. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally, not committing but not refusing either. Outside in the bright sunshine, he took a deep breath. The interaction had been brief and largely unremarkable, yet he felt unsettled by it. There was something about Hannah Redmond that broke through the fog of grief and whiskey he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He wasn't sure if he welcomed the intrusion. For several days, Zachariah avoided town entirely. The ranch provided plenty of tasks to occupy his time and thoughts. A calf was born with a twisted leg that required special attention. A section of fencing along the north property line needed replacing. The routine of physical labor and solitude was familiar, comfortable in its predictability. But at night, alone in the cabin, Samuel's absence remained an open wound. Zachariah had taken to sleeping in his own bed again, unable to bear the smallness of his sons any longer, but he kept the wooden horse on the nightstand. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, he would reach out and touch it, a tangible connection to the boy who was gone. The whiskey helped less and less. What had initially provided numbness now only seemed to sharpen the pain, bringing vivid dreams of Samuel and Mary that left him gasping awake in the pre-dawn darkness. A week after his encounter with Hannah Redmond at the schoolhouse, Zachariah found himself riding toward town again. He told himself it was for supplies, that Miguel was busy with the new calf and couldn't be spared. But as the noon hour approached and his business at the general store concluded, he found his feet carrying him toward the Silver Dollar. The saloon was busier than it had been on his last midday visit. Several tables occupied by men eating the stew that was the establishment's only food offering. Zachariah scanned the room, his eyes finding Hannah in the same spot by the window, newspaper spread before her and steaming cup at her elbow. He hesitated, then approached her table. "Miss Redmond," she looked up, surprise and something like pleasure crossing her face. "Mr. Zimmerman. Would you care to join me?" Zachariah glanced around the saloon. Several patrons were watching with undisguised curiosity. A respectable woman like Hannah taking coffee alone in a saloon was unusual enough. Her being joined by a man would certainly set tongues wagging. "I don't want to cause talk," he said quietly. Hannah smiled slightly. "Mr. Zimmerman, I'm a woman approaching 30 who lives alone and teaches children. People already talk. Please sit if you'd like." After a moment's hesitation, Zachariah pulled out the chair across from her and sat down stiffly. He signaled to the bartender, who brought over a glass of whiskey without being asked. "You come here often," Zachariah observed, not quite a question. "Most days," Hannah confirmed, folding her newspaper. "The boarding house where I live doesn't allow us to use the kitchen between meals, and Mrs. Peterson's cafe is always filled with gossiping women at this hour." She smiled wryly. "Jim makes decent coffee and doesn't mind me occupying this table as long as I buy a cup." Zachariah nodded, understanding the desire for solitude even in a public place. "You board in town then? No family nearby?" "No family at all anymore," Hannah replied matter-of-factly. "My parents died in a fire when I was 22, then Thomas, my brother, 3 years ago." She took a sip of her coffee. "I came west to teach 2 years ago, needed a fresh start." Zachariah appreciated her straightforward accounting, free of self-pity or dramatic embellishment. "How do you find Silverage? Small, predictable?" Hannah's gaze was direct. "But the children need education and the town council pays regularly, which is more than I can say for my last position." They lapsed into silence, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Zachariah sipped his whiskey, aware that he was drinking less quickly than usual. "Do you have many animals on your ranch?" Hannah asked eventually. It was a safe topic, and Zachariah found himself responding with more detail than he'd intended, describing the small but growing herd of cattle, the 2 workhorses, the chickens that provided eggs and occasionally meat. "It sounds like a lot of work for one person," Hannah observed. "I have Miguel," Zachariah replied. "He's been with me for 3 years, good worker, knows cattle better than most men born to it." Hannah nodded. "Still, it must be difficult." Zachariah understood she wasn't just talking about the physical labor of running a ranch. "It is," he acknowledged, surprising himself with the admission. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt companionable rather than awkward. Hannah returned to her newspaper, seemingly content to share the table without forced conversation. Zachariah found it oddly comforting, her presence without demands, her understanding without expectation. When she finished her coffee and rose to leave, Hannah smiled at him. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Zimmerman." "Zachariah," he said suddenly. "You can call me Zachariah." Her smile widened slightly. "Thank you for the company, Zachariah. I'm here most days if you find yourself in town again." After she left, Zachariah remained at the table, nursing his whiskey and watching the activity in the saloon without really seeing it. Something had shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable. The weight of grief still pressed heavily on his chest, but for the brief time he'd sat with Hannah it had seemed slightly more bearable. The realization made him uneasy. He didn't want relief. Relief felt like betrayal, like forgetting, like moving on without Samuel. What right did he have to even moments of peace when his son would never have another moment of anything? He ordered another whiskey, downing it quickly this time. Summer stretched into early autumn, the Montana landscape transforming as trees began to turn gold and crimson. Zachariah fell into a pattern without fully acknowledging it. Every few days, he would find a reason to ride into Silverage around noon. Sometimes Hannah would be at their table in the silver dollar. He'd begun to think of it as theirs, and sometimes she wouldn't. When she was there, they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Hannah never pressed him to discuss Samuel or his grief, but she listened when he occasionally volunteered small details about his son, that he'd been learning to play checkers, that he'd named every chicken on the ranch, that he'd had Mary's laugh. In return, Zachariah learned about Hannah. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who'd once dreamed of being a writer. She'd followed in her father's footsteps, teaching since she was 19. She preferred coffee to tea, enjoyed reading adventure stories as well as more serious literature, and had never learned to swim despite growing up near a lake. These exchanges weren't friendship exactly, at least not as Zachariah had ever experienced it. They were something different, moments of connection that existed only within the confines of that table by the window, with no expectations beyond the hour they shared. Outside the saloon, they maintained a polite distance. If they encountered each other on the street or in the general store, they exchanged brief greetings and continued on their separate ways. Zachariah was grateful for this tacit agreement. He wasn't ready for whatever was growing between them to exist in the broader world. One crisp October afternoon, Zachariah arrived at the Silver Dollar to find Hannah already at their table, but with a different companion, a young girl of perhaps 12, with long dark braids and a serious expression. Hannah looked up as he approached, smiling. "Zachariah, this is Lily Martinez." "She's one of my students. Lily, this is Mr. Zimmerman." The girl nodded politely. "Sir." Zachariah tipped his hat, uncertain how to proceed. He'd never seen Hannah with one of her students outside the schoolhouse. "Lily is helping me with a special project," Hannah explained, gesturing to the papers spread on the table between them. "She's translating some information for the younger Spanish-speaking children. Her English is excellent." The girl ducked her head at the praise, but Zachariah could see she was pleased. "I don't want to interrupt," he said, preparing to retreat to the bar. "Nonsense," Hannah replied. "We're almost finished for today. Lily needs to return to her parents soon." She turned to the girl. "Can you complete the last page for tomorrow?" Lily nodded, gathering the papers carefully. "Yes, Miss Redmond, I'll have it ready for morning lessons." After the girl had gone, Zachariah took his usual seat across from Hannah. "You teach Spanish-speaking children?" "Several," Hannah confirmed. "The Martinez family, the Garcias, the Rodriguezes, most came to work on the railroad and stayed after it was completed. The children are eager learners, but the language barrier can be challenging." "So you're having Lily translate your lessons?" Hannah nodded. "For the youngest ones, yes. The older children pick up English more quickly." She smiled slightly. "Your Miguel has been helpful too. He's been teaching me Spanish words when he comes to town." Zachariah raised an eyebrow. "Miguel speaks to you?" Hannah laughed, a sound Zachariah realized he'd never heard before. It was unexpectedly musical. "He does, though I suspect he speaks more freely to me than to most in town. I think he appreciates my interest in his language." Zachariah absorbed this information with surprise. Miguel was respectful but generally reserved around townsfolk, many of whom viewed Mexicans with suspicion or outright hostility. "I didn't know you were learning Spanish," he said finally. Hannah shrugged. "How else will I teach the children properly? Besides, I enjoy learning new things." There was something in the simple statement that struck Zachariah. Hannah faced challenges with a practical approach, finding solutions rather than dwelling on obstacles. It was a stark contrast to his own response to adversity, which had been to retreat into isolation and whiskey. "You're a good teacher," he observed. "I try to be," she replied. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she added, "You haven't been drinking as much." The observation, delivered without judgment, caught him off guard. It was true, over the past weeks he'd reduced his whiskey consumption considerably. Some days, sitting with Hannah, he had only one drink, sometimes none at all. "No," he acknowledged. "I haven't." Hannah didn't press for more, and Zachariah was grateful. He wasn't ready to examine what that change might mean, or to acknowledge the role she might have played in it. The comfortable silence that had become familiar between them settled again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window beside them. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder. Winter would arrive soon, bringing snow and increased isolation for those on outlying ranches like Zachariah's. "Will you continue coming to town when winter sets in?" Hannah asked, as if reading his thoughts. "When I can," Zachariah replied. "Snow makes the ride difficult sometimes." Hannah nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I understand. The school often closes for days or even weeks during the worst storms." "What do you do then?" Zachariah found himself genuinely curious. "Read, mostly, write letters to old friends back east, work on new lesson plans." She smiled wryly. The boarding house can become rather confining after a few days, with Mrs. Winters constantly fussing over everyone. Zachariah tried to imagine Hannah confined to a small room in the town's only boarding house, surrounded by the other single women who lived there, mostly shop clerks, and the unmarried sister of the bank manager, if he recalled correctly. "You could visit the ranch," he said, the words escaping before he'd fully considered them. "When weather permits, of course, if you wanted a change of scenery." Hannah looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. "I'd like that," she said after a moment. "Thank you." Zachariah nodded, somewhat startled by his own invitation. It had been over a year since he'd had any visitor to the ranch besides Miguel and occasionally Dr. Wilson. The idea of Hannah in his home in the space that still held so many memories of Samuel was both unsettling and strangely appealing. "It's not much," he warned, "just a simple cabin." "I'm sure it's lovely," Hannah replied, "and I'd enjoy seeing your animals. I've always liked horses, though I don't have much occasion to ride these days." The conversation shifted to safer topics: the upcoming harvest festival the town was planning, the new shipment of books Hannah was expecting for the school. But Zachariah's mind kept returning to the invitation he'd extended. It represented a step beyond their carefully bounded interaction in the saloon, a widening of the narrow connection they'd established. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that expansion, but he found he didn't want to retract the offer either. The first snow came earlier than usual that year, a heavy, wet blanket that transformed the landscape overnight in mid-November. Zachariah woke to a world of white, the familiar contours of his ranch rendered strange and new under the pristine covering. For the first time in months, he thought of the approaching Christmas season without immediate dread. Last year, Samuel had been alive, his excitement about the holiday infectious. Zachariah had cut a small pine tree from the north ridge and brought it into the cabin. They decorated it with paper chains Samuel had made and a star Zachariah had carved from wood. The memory still ached, but it didn't destroy him as it might have months ago. He spent the morning ensuring the animals were properly sheltered and fed, the cold biting through his gloves and making his breath steam in the frigid air. By noon, the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue, the sun reflecting blindingly off the snow. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he'd been to town, the ranch requiring his full attention as he prepared for winter. He wondered if Hannah missed their meetings, then immediately chided himself for the thought. She had her own life, her students, her other acquaintances in town. Their occasional shared coffee was likely of little consequence to her. Yet, he found himself thinking of her more often than he cared to admit. Her calm presence, the thoughtful way she listened, the rare but genuine smile that transformed her serious face, these had become fixed in his mind, emerging in quiet moments when his guard was down. 3 days after the first snow, Zachariah was checking the fence line on the eastern boundary of his property when he spotted a figure on horseback approaching along the road. Visitors were rare, especially in winter, and he tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. As the rider drew closer, Zachariah relaxed his stance. It was Hannah, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, her breath clouding around her as she guided a sturdy brown mare toward him. "Miss Redmond," he called, walking to meet her, "this is unexpected." Hannah reined her horse to a stop, smiling down at him. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright. "The school is closed due to the snow, and Mrs. Winters was driving everyone mad with her fussing. I remembered your invitation. She hesitated. I hope it's not an imposition. Not at all, Zachariah replied, surprised to find he meant it. The ranch is this way. You can stable your horse in the barn. He led her back toward the cabin, acutely aware of how the place might appear to a visitor. The structure was solid and well-maintained, but simple, one large room with a stone fireplace, his bed in one corner, Samuel's in another, now serving as storage for winter supplies. A table and chairs, a small bookshelf, a rocking chair Mary had loved, nothing fancy, but it had been home. The barn was their first stop, where Hannah dismounted and helped Zachariah settle her mare in an empty stall. She moved with easy competence around the animal, confirming what she'd said about being comfortable with horses. She's a rental from the livery, Hannah explained as she removed the saddle. Mr. Jenkins knows I can ride, so he lets me take Daisy out occasionally. She's a good animal, Zachariah observed, noting the horse's calm demeanor and healthy coat. They walked to the cabin together, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Zachariah immediately set about building it back up while Hannah removed her outer layers. It's lovely, she said, looking around the cabin with genuine interest. Did you build it yourself? Zachariah nodded, arranging logs in the fireplace. Most of it had help with the roof. You've made a real home here, Hannah commented, moving to the window to look out at the snow-covered landscape. Zachariah straightened, brushing his hands on his pants. It was. A home. The past tense hung between them. Hannah turned to face him, her expression solemn. It still can be, you know, different but still a home. Zachariah didn't reply, unsure how to respond to the gentle challenge in her words. Instead, he gestured to the small kitchen area. Would you like coffee, or I can make tea? Coffee would be wonderful, Hannah replied, allowing the subject to drop. As Zachariah busied himself with the coffee pot, Hannah moved around the cabin, her attention caught by the small bookshelf. You read Thoreau? She asked, surprised, touching the spine of Walden. It was Mary's, Zachariah explained. My wife, she loved books. Hannah nodded, continuing her perusal. And these, she asked, indicating a shelf of children's books. Samuel's, Zachariah said, the name still catching slightly in his throat. He was just learning to read. Hannah selected one, a well-worn copy of fairy tales. This was my favorite as a child, she said, carefully opening it. My father used to read me the story of the 12 dancing princesses every night for nearly a year. I never tired of it. Zachariah watched her as she gently turned the pages, her expression soft with remembrance. Samuel liked the one about the boy who cried wolf, he found himself saying. Even though he knew how it ended every time, he always hoped the villagers would come. Hannah looked up, meeting his gaze. Children believe in second chances, she said quietly. Perhaps we should learn from them. The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Zachariah broke eye contact first, turning back to the coffee that was now ready. They spent the afternoon in surprisingly easy companionship. Hannah helped Zachariah feed the chickens, laughing as they pecked eagerly at the grain she scattered. They checked on the cattle in the lower pasture, their breaths forming clouds in the crisp air. When the temperature dropped as the sun began its early winter descent, they returned to the cabin, where Zachariah prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. This is delicious, Hannah said, clearly enjoying the food. I didn't know you could cook, Zachariah shrugged. Had to learn after Mary died, can't live on jerky alone. Samuel must have appreciated your efforts, Hannah observed, Zachariah's hand stilled briefly. He did, though he always claimed his mother's cornbread was better. He was probably right, Hannah said with a smile. My mother's cooking always tasted better than anyone else's, even when objectively it wasn't. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling in the hearth and casting warm light throughout the cabin. Outside, the early winter darkness had fallen completely, stars appearing in a clear sky that promised another cold night. I should return to town before it gets any later, Hannah said finally, setting down her empty cup. Zachariah glanced out the window at the deepening night. It's already too dark for safe riding, he said. The trail can be treacherous even in daylight with this much snow. Hannah followed his gaze, a small frown creasing her brow. I hadn't realized how late it had grown. You can take my bed, Zachariah offered. I'll sleep on the floor by the fire. Hannah's cheeks colored slightly. I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition, Zachariah interrupted. It's common sense, you can return to town in the morning. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah nodded. Thank you. I don't want to risk Daisy breaking a leg in a hidden hole. The practical concern for the horse seemed to settle the matter for her, and Zachariah was reminded again of her pragmatic nature. He busied himself preparing sleeping arrangements, adding wood to the fire to ensure it would last through the night, and setting up a makeshift bed of blankets on the floor nearby. Hannah insisted on helping clean up after their meal, working alongside him with easy efficiency. The domestic scene struck Zachariah with its normality, something he hadn't experienced since long before Samuel's death. There was comfort in the simple routine, in having another person share the space and the tasks. When everything was settled, an awkward moment ensued as they both recognized the intimacy of the sleeping arrangements, regardless of their practical necessity. I have a nightshirt you could use, Zachariah offered, moving to a trunk at the foot of his bed. It was Mary's, but she was tall. It should fit well enough. Hannah accepted the folded garment with a grateful nod. Thank you, I'll just… She glanced around the one-room cabin. I'll step outside while you change, Zachariah said, already reaching for his coat. The night air was bitter cold, the stars impossibly bright in the clear sky. Zachariah stood on the porch, his breath forming clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The familiar sounds of the ranch at night surrounded him, a horse nickering softly in the barn, the distant howl of a coyote, the creaking of trees as their branches shifted in the light breeze. He thought of Hannah inside his cabin, wearing Mary's nightshirt, preparing to sleep in his bed. The image was both disconcerting and strangely right, as if some missing piece had temporarily slotted into place in his fragmented life. You can come in now, Hannah called softly from inside. She was already in his bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, her clothes neatly folded on a chair nearby. The nightshirt's high collar was visible, as was her honey-colored hair, freed from its usual knot and flowing over the pillow. Zachariah averted his eyes, moving to his makeshift bed by the fire. Are you comfortable enough? He asked, focusing on arranging his own blankets. Yes, thank you, Hannah replied. This is very kind of you. Just being practical, Zachariah said, echoing her earlier reasoning. He removed his boots and outer shirt, then lay down on his blankets, still fully clothed otherwise. The fire cast flickering shadows on the ceiling, and he fixed his gaze on them, acutely aware of Hannah's presence a few feet away. Zachariah, Hannah's voice was soft in the dimness. Yes. Thank you for today, for sharing your home. Zachariah swallowed against a sudden tightness in his throat. You're welcome. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet they usually shared at the saloon. This silence was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts and the strange intimacy of two people preparing to sleep in the same room. Good night, Hannah murmured eventually. Good night, Zachariah replied. He lay awake long after her breathing had deepened into sleep, listening to the subtle sounds of another person sharing his space. It had been months since he'd heard such sounds, Samuel's soft snores, his occasional murmuring in dreams. The familiar ache of grief rose in his chest, but it was tempered now by something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the frost-edged windows. Zachariah woke early, as was his habit, and built up the fire before Hannah stirred. He slipped outside to tend to the animals, giving her privacy to dress. When he returned, she was fully clothed and had made both beds, her hair once again neatly arranged. She'd also started coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the pot on the stove. I thought it was the least I could do. Not at all, Zachariah replied, stamping snow from his boots. Thank you. They shared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and the last of the previous day's cornbread. The awkwardness of the night before had dissipated, replaced by the easy companionship they'd established over their many meetings at the Silver Dollar. The trail should be safe enough now, Zachariah observed as they finished eating. The sun's been up for a while. Hannah nodded, though Zachariah thought he detected a hint of reluctance in her expression. Yes, I should get back. School will likely resume tomorrow, and I need to prepare. Zachariah helped her saddle Daisy, the mare nickering softly in greeting as they entered the barn. The morning was cold but clear, the snow glistening in the sunlight. Thank you again for your hospitality, Hannah said as she mounted. It was nice seeing where you live, meeting your animals. Zachariah nodded, his hand resting on Daisy's neck. You're welcome to visit again. When weather permits. Hannah smiled down at him, her cheeks pink from the cold. I'd like that. He watched her ride away, the figure growing smaller against the vast white landscape. Only when she had disappeared from view did he return to the cabin, which suddenly seemed emptier than it had in months. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed quickly, filled with the extra work winter always brought to the ranch. Zachariah made it to town only twice, finding Hannah at their table in the Silver Dollar both times. They didn't discuss her overnight stay at the ranch directly, but there was a new ease between them, as if some invisible barrier had been crossed. On his second visit, just 3 days before Christmas, Hannah presented him with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It isn't much, she said as he looked at it in surprise, just something I thought you might enjoy. Zachariah opened it carefully to find a book, a collection of essays by Emerson. Thank you, he said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, but I didn't get you anything. Hannah shook her head. I didn't expect anything. It's a simple gift between friends. The word hung between them, a definition of what they had become. It was accurate, Zachariah supposed, though it didn't quite encompass the particular quality of their connection. The school is having a small Christmas celebration tomorrow, Hannah said after a moment. Just songs and recitations by the children, followed by cake and punch. You'd be welcome to attend if you'd like. Zachariah hesitated. He hadn't participated in any community events since Samuel's death, preferring to keep to himself. The thought of being surrounded by happy children and festive parents made his chest tighten. I understand if it's too much, Hannah added softly, reading his expression. I just wanted you to know you're welcome. Thank you, Zachariah said finally. I'll consider it. They parted soon after, Zachariah needing to return to the ranch before dark. As he rode home, the book carefully stowed in his saddlebag, he found himself genuinely considering Hannah's invitation. The thought of attending still filled him with dread, but there was also a desire to see Hannah in her element, surrounded by her students. And perhaps a small voice whispered in his mind it was time to stop hiding from life entirely. The next afternoon found Zachariah standing at the back of the schoolhouse, hat in hand, watching as Hannah led her students through a series of Christmas carols. The room was crowded with parents and siblings, everyone dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Thursday. Hannah hadn't seen him yet. She was focused on the children, her face animated as she guided them through Silent Night. She wore a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, with a small sprig of holly pinned to the collar. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with soft curls framing her face. When the song ended, she turned to address the audience, and her eyes widened slightly as she spotted Zachariah. A smile bloomed across her face, genuine pleasure at his presence evident in her expression. The program continued with recitations of Christmas poems and a short nativity play performed by the youngest children. Zachariah remained at the back, uncomfortable but determined to stay. Occasionally, Hannah would glance his way, as if ensuring he was still there. After the formal program ended, refreshments were served: cake, cookies, and punch laid out on tables decorated with pine boughs. Parents congratulated their children and chatted among themselves. Zachariah stood awkwardly apart, considering slipping out unnoticed now that the performances were over. You came, Hannah said, appearing at his side with 2 cups of punch. She handed one to him, her eyes warm. I'm glad. The children did well, Zachariah replied, accepting the cup. They worked very hard, Hannah agreed. She hesitated, then added, "It means a lot that you're here." "I know it can't be easy." Zachariah nodded, his throat tight. "It isn't," he admitted, "but life continues." Hannah's expression softened. "Yes, it does." She glanced around the room, then back to him. "Would you like to meet some of my students, or would you prefer to avoid the crowd?" The fact that she offered him the choice, understanding his potential discomfort, cemented Zachariah's growing realization that Hannah Redmond was unlike anyone he'd ever known. "I'd like to meet them," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. Hannah led him around the room, introducing him to students and parents alike. She referred to him simply as "my friend, Mr. Zimmerman," but there was a warmth in her voice that didn't escape notice, particularly from the mothers in attendance, who exchanged knowing glances. By the time they'd completed the circuit of the room, Zachariah found himself more at ease than he'd expected. The children's excitement was infectious, and Hannah's obvious pride in them was endearing. He discovered he enjoyed seeing this side of her, the teacher, respected and admired by her community. As the celebration wound down, Hannah was called away to help a mother with a fussy toddler, leaving Zachariah momentarily alone. He was considering whether to wait for her return or take his leave when Walter Green approached, his wife on his arm. "Zimmerman," Green greeted him, extending a hand. "Good to see you here, didn't expect it." Zachariah shook his hand briefly. "Green, Mrs. Green." "Miss Redmond is a fine teacher," Mrs. Green said, her eyes darting between Zachariah and Hannah, who was visible across the room. "The children adore her." "Yes," Zachariah agreed neutrally, aware of the woman's curiosity. "Been seeing a lot of you and the teacher together at the Silver Dollar," Green observed, his tone carefully casual. "Good to see you getting out more." Zachariah stiffened slightly. "Miss Redmond and I occasionally share a table, nothing more, Mrs." Green's expression suggested she didn't believe him, but she merely smiled. "Well, she's a lovely young woman, smart as a whip, too. Any man would be fortunate to court her." Before Zachariah could respond to this obvious hint, Hannah returned, her smile slightly strained as she took in the group. "Mr. and Mrs. Green, I hope you enjoyed the program," she said politely. "Wonderful, as always, dear," Mrs. Green replied. "We were just telling Mr. Zimmerman what a treasure you are to Silveridge." Hannah's cheeks colored slightly. "That's very kind. If you'll excuse us, I need to speak with Mr. Zimmerman about a book he's lending me." She deftly extracted them from the conversation, leading Zachariah toward the door. "I apologize if they were being intrusive," she said quietly. "Mrs. Green fancies herself a matchmaker." "I noticed," Zachariah replied dryly. They stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the sun already beginning its early winter descent. "Thank you for coming," Hannah said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "It meant a great deal to me." Zachariah nodded, suddenly uncertain what to say. The easy companionship they'd established at the Silver Dollar and during Hannah's visit to the ranch seemed altered somehow, charged with new awareness after the Greens' comments. "I should return to the ranch," he said finally. "Storm's coming. Can smell it in the air." Hannah glanced at the sky, which was clear despite the biting cold. "You can tell, years of practice," Zachariah confirmed. "It'll hit by tonight. Might want to prepare for school to be closed tomorrow," Hannah smiled. "I'll take your word for it. You know this country better than I do." They stood for a moment in silence, breath clouding between them in the frigid air. "Merry Christmas, Zachariah," Hannah said softly, "in case I don't see you before." "Merry Christmas, Hannah," he replied, the use of her first name deliberate and significant. He rode home with his thoughts in turmoil, the memory of Hannah's smile when she'd spotted him at the celebration replaying in his mind. The Greens' insinuations had brought to the surface questions he'd been avoiding for weeks. What exactly was developing between him and Hannah Redmond? And more importantly, what did he want to develop? The storm Zachariah had predicted arrived with full force that night, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow on the region and effectively isolating the ranch for the next week. He spent the days tending to his animals and weathering the bitter cold, grateful for the sturdy cabin and well-stocked woodpile. On Christmas morning, he woke early as usual and built up the fire. The cabin was quiet, the storm having passed but leaving a pristine blanket of snow that muffled all sound from outside. For the first time, Zachariah deliberately allowed himself to remember the previous Christmas Samuel's excitement as he opened his gifts, the small feast they'd prepared together, the stories they'd read by the fire. The memories brought pain, but not the devastating grief of months past. There was room now for fondness alongside the sorrow, for gratitude that he'd had those moments with his son, even if there would be no more. After completing his morning chores, Zachariah returned to the cabin and, on impulse, took out the book Hannah had given him. He settled in the rocking chair by the fire and began to read, finding unexpected solace in Emerson's words about nature and the human spirit. Hours passed as he read, the short winter day fading toward dusk outside his windows. When he finally set the book aside, Zachariah realized he'd spent Christmas Day in a state of mind that, if not exactly peace, was at least free from the crushing weight of grief that had defined his existence for so long. And he knew, with sudden clarity, that Hannah Redmond was responsible for that change. The realization should have frightened him, the acknowledgement that another person had become important to him, that he was opening himself to potential loss again. Instead, he found it brought a quiet sense of rightness, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. It was another week before the trails were clear enough for safe travel to town. Zachariah set out early one morning, the sun bright on the snow-covered landscape. His ostensible purpose was supplies, but he knew his true destination was the Silver Dollar at noon, where he hoped to find Hannah. Silverage was quiet, still recovering from the storm. Many of the outlying farms and ranches remained isolated, so the usual bustle of town was subdued. Zachariah completed his business at the general store quickly, noting that Green seemed surprised but pleased to see him. School's still closed, Green mentioned as he wrapped Zachariah's purchases. Too many families can't get their children to town safely yet. Miss Redmond's been helping at the church, distributing food to those in need. Zachariah nodded, absorbing this information. The church is open today, till 4, I believe, Green replied. Pastor Miller and Miss Redmond have been there every day since the storm broke. Zachariah thanked him and left, his steps turning toward the small white church at the edge of town rather than the saloon. He'd never been inside, having avoided religious services since Mary's death, but now he found himself climbing the steps and pushing open the heavy wooden door. The interior was simple but warm, with plain wooden pews and modest stained glass windows. At the front beside the pulpit, tables had been set up with baskets of food. Hannah stood there, speaking with an elderly couple who were accepting a basket with evident gratitude. She looked tired, Zachariah thought as he approached, with shadows under her eyes suggesting long days of work. But when she looked up and saw him, her face transformed, weariness replaced by genuine delight. Zachariah, she said, excusing herself from the couple. You made it through the snow. Trails cleared enough yesterday, he replied. Needed supplies. Hannah nodded, her eyes searching his face. How was your Christmas? Quiet, Zachariah said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, I read the book you gave me, thank you. Did you enjoy it? Hannah asked, clearly pleased. Very much, Zachariah confirmed. Emerson has a way of seeing the world that helps. Hannah's smile deepened at his words. Yes, exactly. That's why I thought you might appreciate him. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken when Pastor Miller approached, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes. Miss Redmond, perhaps you should take a break, he suggested. You've been here since sunrise. Hannah began to protest, but the pastor held up a hand. I insist. Mr. Zimmerman, perhaps you could escort Miss Redmond to get some lunch. She's barely stopped to eat these past days. Before either could respond, he continued, the Ladies' Aid Society will be here within the hour to take over. You've done more than your share, Miss Redmond. Recognizing defeat, Hannah nodded. Very well, Pastor, thank you. Outside, the cold air was bracing after the warmth of the church. Hannah wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, shivering slightly. The Silver Dollar, Zachariah suggested. For coffee, Hannah hesitated. Actually, I'm rather tired of being in public spaces. Would you mind terribly if we went to my room at the boarding house instead? Mrs. Winters is visiting her sister in Helena, so the house is quiet. I could make us tea." The suggestion surprised Zachariah, but he nodded. "If you prefer." The boarding house was a large, well-maintained building on a side street, its front parlor visible through lace-curtained windows. Hannah led him inside and up a narrow staircase to the second floor. "My room is at the end," she explained, leading the way down a hallway lined with doors. "It's small, but it has the best light for reading." She unlocked the last door on the right and ushered him in. The room was indeed small, but neat and surprisingly personal. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a dresser and washstand against another. A small desk beneath the window was piled with books and papers. A comfortable-looking armchair was positioned nearby, clearly Hannah's reading spot. What struck Zachariah most were the touches that made the space uniquely hers: the colorful quilt on the bed, the small vase of dried flowers on the dresser, the framed sketches on the walls that he guessed were her own work. "Please sit," Hannah said, gesturing to the armchair while she lit a small spirit lamp to heat water for tea. "I'm sorry it's so cramped." "It's nice," Zachariah replied honestly. "Suits you?" Hannah smiled, pleased by his observation. "It's home for now at least." As she prepared the tea, Zachariah found his gaze drawn to the sketches on the walls, simple but evocative drawings of landscapes, animals, and a few portraits. One in particular caught his attention. A young man with a mischievous smile, his resemblance to Hannah unmistakable. "Your brother?" he asked. Hannah glanced up, following his gaze. "Yes, Thomas, I drew that about a year before he died." She brought over 2 cups of tea, offering one to Zachariah before perching on the edge of her bed, there being no other chair in the room. "You're talented," Zachariah observed, nodding toward the sketches. Hannah shrugged modestly. "It's just a hobby. My father encouraged it. He said everyone should have something they do purely for joy." "What did your father teach?" Zachariah asked, remembering she'd mentioned following in his footsteps. "Literature and history at a small academy in Pennsylvania," Hannah replied, warming her hands on her teacup. "He loved the classics: Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare. He used to quote them at breakfast, much to my mother's amusement." Zachariah tried to imagine such a household filled with books and learning, with parents who encouraged artistic pursuits and quoted poetry at the breakfast table. It was far removed from his own upbringing on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, where education had been secondary to survival. "And your mother? You said she wanted to be a writer," Hannah nodded, her expression softening with memory. "She wrote stories, beautiful ones, though she never tried to publish them. She read them to Thomas and me at bedtime." She smiled slightly. "My father always said she was the true artist in the family, but she insisted her only audience would be her children." "You miss them?" Zachariah observed, not a question but a recognition. "Every day," Hannah confirmed, "but it's different now than it was at first. The pain has transformed, I suppose. It's still there, but it doesn't consume everything anymore." Zachariah nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. His own grief for Samuel was changing, still profound, still present, but no longer the only thing he could feel. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, setting his empty teacup on the small table beside the chair. "About what you said. That a place can still be a home even when it's different from before." Hannah's eyes were steady on his face, waiting. "I think you were right," Zachariah continued. "The ranch, it's still home, it's just a different home now." "And is that all right?" Hannah asked softly. Zachariah considered the question carefully. "I think it has to be," he replied finally, "because the alternative is having no home at all." Hannah nodded, understanding in her gaze. "Life continues," she said, echoing his words from the school Christmas celebration. "Yes," Zachariah agreed. "It does." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the small room warm and intimate around them. Outside, the winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. "I should go," Zachariah said eventually, reluctant but aware of propriety. "People will talk if I'm seen leaving the boarding house too late," Hannah smiled wryly. "People already talk. Mrs. Green has been not so subtly inquiring about my intentions toward you for weeks." Zachariah raised an eyebrow. Your intentions? Hannah's cheeks colored slightly. Apparently, unmarried women who share coffee with widowers must have ulterior motives. And do you? Zachariah asked, the question escaping before he could consider it. Have intentions? Hannah met his gaze steadily, though her blush deepened. I value your friendship greatly, Zachariah. Beyond that, I try not to form intentions without knowing if they might be welcomed. The carefully worded response hung between them, its underlying meaning clear. Hannah was giving him the opportunity to define what existed between them, to acknowledge it as mere friendship, or something with the potential for more. Zachariah found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated reaching so soon. Part of him wanted to retreat, to maintain the safe distance of friendship without risking the pain that deeper attachment might bring. But another part, growing stronger daily, recognized that Hannah Redmond had already breached the walls around his heart, whether he acknowledged it or not. I think, he said finally, his voice low, that your intentions would be welcomed, whatever they might be. Hannah's eyes widened slightly, and she set her teacup aside with a hand that trembled just perceptibly. Zachariah, she said softly, are you certain? I would never want to rush you or presume. I'm not certain of much these days, Zachariah interrupted gently. Except that when I'm with you, the world seems less empty. Hannah stood then, crossing the small space between them. She hesitated before the armchair, then reached out to touch his face, her fingers light against his cheek. For me as well, she whispered. Zachariah covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face for a moment before gently pulling her down to sit on the arm of the chair. They were close now, her skirts brushing against his leg, her face mere inches from his. I don't know if I remember how to do this, Zachariah admitted quietly, how to care for someone again. Hannah's smile was gentle. Neither do I, perhaps we can learn together. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Zachariah leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, but it deepened as Hannah responded, her hand moving to rest on his shoulder. When they parted, Hannah's eyes remained closed for a moment, her expression one of quiet wonder. Zachariah found himself studying her face, the curve of her cheek, the small freckle near her temple, the way her lashes lay against her skin. That was. Hannah began, then stopped, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. Yes, Zachariah agreed, understanding what she couldn't quite articulate. It had been both familiar and entirely new, comforting and exhilarating at once. Hannah smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. Mrs. Green will be insufferable when she finds out. Zachariah couldn't help the low chuckle that escaped him, the first genuine laugh he'd experienced in longer than he could remember. Let her be, he said, surprising himself with how little he cared about town gossip. The light outside had faded considerably, the winter dusk settling over Silveridge. Zachariah knew he should leave. The ride back to the ranch would be cold and dark as it was, but he was reluctant to end this moment, this new beginning. Hannah seemed to read his thoughts. You should go before it gets any darker, she said, though she made no move to rise from the arm of the chair. The trail can be dangerous at night. Yes, Zachariah agreed, equally motionless. They looked at each other for a long moment, the reality of what had just transpired settling between them. Zachariah, Hannah said finally, her voice soft but steady. I want you to know that I understand Samuel will always be part of your life. I would never wish to change that or diminish his memory in any way. The simple statement, delivered with such sincere understanding, touched Zachariah deeply. He took her hand, pressing it between both of his. Thank you, he said simply. That means more than I can express. Hannah nodded, then leaned down to press another brief kiss to his lips before standing. Now you really must go before we both forget propriety entirely. Zachariah rose, reluctantly acknowledging the wisdom of her words. At the door, he turned back to her. When can I see you again? I'm at the church most days until the storm recovery efforts are complete, Hannah replied. But perhaps you could come to dinner here on Sunday. Mrs. Winters will be back by then, so everything would be perfectly proper. Sunday, Zachariah agreed, though the thought of a formal dinner with the boarding house mistress and other boarders was less than appealing. But it would mean seeing Hannah again, and that was worth any amount of social discomfort. The ride back to the ranch was cold but strangely exhilarating. Zachariah found his mind replaying the kiss, the feel of Hannah's hand against his face, the look in her eyes when they'd parted. It had been so long since he'd experienced such emotions that they felt almost foreign, yet undeniably right. As the cabin came into view, its windows dark and its outlines stark against the snow, Zachariah was struck by the contrast between the emptiness he'd felt riding home after Samuel's death and the fullness he felt now, despite returning to the same solitary space. Hannah had been right. Life continued, and perhaps, against all odds, it could be good again. The winter months passed with a rhythm Zachariah hadn't experienced since before Samuel's death. Work on the ranch occupied his days feeding animals, repairing equipment, planning for spring calving. But his life was no longer confined to the isolated routine of survival. Twice a week, weather permitting, he rode into Silveridge. Sometimes they met at the Silver Dollar for coffee, maintaining their established pattern. Other times, they walked together through town or along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. On Sundays, Zachariah endured dinner at the boarding house, where Mrs. Winters watched him with eagle eyes and the other boarders pretended not to observe the growing attachment between him and Hannah. By unspoken agreement, they took things slowly. There were more kisses, stolen moments of privacy when they could find them, but nothing more. Both recognized the seriousness of what was developing between them and the need to be certain before taking irrevocable steps. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their losses. Hannah spoke of her parents' death in the fire that had consumed their home while she was away teaching, of her guilt at not being there, of her subsequent responsibility for her younger brother. Zachariah shared memories of Mary, of their early struggles to establish the ranch, of the joy and terror he'd felt when Samuel was born. These exchanges, honest and sometimes painful, strengthened the bond between them. There were no secrets, no taboo subjects. Even in silence, they found understanding in each other's company. March brought the first signs of spring, patches of ground emerging from melting snow, birdsong returning to the trees, days lengthening noticeably. With the improved weather came increased activity at the ranch as Zachariah prepared for calving season. "I won't be able to come to town as often for the next few weeks," he explained to Hannah one afternoon as they walked by the creek. "The first calves are due any day and they'll need constant monitoring." Hannah nodded, understanding the demands of ranch life. "Of course, your livelihood depends on a successful calving season." Zachariah took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "I'll miss our meetings." Hannah smiled, squeezing his fingers. "Then perhaps I could visit the ranch again. On Saturdays, when there's no school, I could help, or at least keep you company." The offer delighted Zachariah more than he could express. The thought of Hannah at the ranch, not just as a visitor seeking shelter from a storm but as a regular presence, felt right in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'd like that," he said simply, and so a new pattern was established. Zachariah focused on the ranch during the week, while Hannah continued her teaching duties. On Saturdays, she would ride out to the ranch on Daisy, often staying until Sunday afternoon before returning to town in time for the school week. Mrs. Winters disapproved of this arrangement, despite Hannah's assurances that she slept in Samuel's bed, while Zachariah took the floor by the fire, the same arrangement as during her first, unplanned visit. But Hannah was firm in her independence, reminding the boarding house mistress that at 29 she was well past the age of requiring a chaperone. The town gossips had a field day, of course. Walter Green's wife was particularly active in spreading speculation about when an announcement might be expected. But neither Hannah nor Zachariah paid much attention to the talk. What existed between them was too precious, too carefully tended, to be affected by outside opinions. April brought a profusion of calves, keeping Zachariah busy day and night. Hannah proved surprisingly helpful during her weekend visits, having grown up around farm animals despite her more academic upbringing. She had a natural way with the newborn calves, patient and gentle as she helped check them for health issues. "You're good with them," Zachariah observed one Saturday as Hannah successfully coaxed a reluctant calf to nurse from its mother for the first time. Hannah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron, one of Mary's that she now wore when helping with ranch chores. "Animals are simpler than children. Their needs are more straightforward. Do you miss teaching during these weekends?" Zachariah asked, curious about whether she found the ranch life tedious compared to her intellectual work. Hannah considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I love teaching, helping young minds develop. But there's something satisfying about this kind of work, two immediate results, tangible accomplishments." She gestured toward the nursing calf. "That little one will live because we helped. There's real value in that." Zachariah nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was one of the aspects of ranch life he'd always appreciated, the direct relationship between effort and outcome, the visible results of his labor. "Besides," Hannah added with a smile, "I get the best of both worlds this way, teaching during the week, ranch life on weekends." The simple statement held implications that Zachariah couldn't ignore. It suggested a future where this arrangement might continue, where Hannah's presence at the ranch might become permanent rather than occasional. The thought both thrilled and frightened him. Marriage had been far from his mind after Mary's death, and Samuel's loss had only reinforced his isolation. Yet here was Hannah, fitting so naturally into his life, bringing light and warmth back into spaces that had been dark and cold for too long. That night, after a simple dinner, they sat before the fire as had become their custom. Hannah was mending one of Zachariah's shirts, her hands moving deftly with needle and thread. Zachariah watched her, struck again by how right she looked in his cabin, how seamlessly she'd integrated herself into his life. "Hannah," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking." She looked up, her expression curious. "About what?" Zachariah hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. He'd planned no speech, prepared no formal proposal, yet he knew with absolute certainty what he wanted. "About us," he said simply. "About the future." Hannah set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. "I've been thinking about that too." Zachariah moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I never expected to find happiness again after Samuel died. I thought that part of my life was over." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "But then you shared that table with me at the Silver Dollar and something changed." Hannah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "For me as well," she whispered. "I love you, Hannah Redmond," Zachariah said, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural on his tongue. "I want to build a life with you here if you're willing. It won't always be easy. Ranch life is hard, and I'm still learning how to live with my grief. But I want to learn with you beside me." Hannah freed one hand to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you too, Zachariah, and yes, I'm willing, more than willing." Zachariah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a ring, simple but elegant, with a single small diamond. "It was Mary's," he explained softly. "If that's not appropriate, I understand. I can get another." Hannah shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "It's perfectly appropriate," she assured him. "A symbol of continuity, of life going on. I would be honored to wear it." Zachariah slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. Then he rose, drawing Hannah to her feet and into his arms. Their kiss was deep and tender, a promise of the future they would build together. Later, as they sat side by side before the fire, Hannah's head resting on his shoulder and the ring catching the firelight on her finger, Zachariah felt a sense of completion he had thought forever beyond his reach. "I was thinking," Hannah said softly, "that we could be married in June after the school term ends. It would give us time to prepare and the weather should be beautiful." Zachariah nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "June sounds perfect." "And I was wondering," Hannah continued, a slight hesitation in her voice, if you might consider adopting a child someday. There are so many orphans who need homes, especially after the war and with all the illnesses that sweep through communities. The question caught Zachariah by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Hannah's concern for children was part of who she was, evidenced by her dedication to teaching and her special attention to those most in need. "I would consider it," he said honestly. "Not immediately, perhaps. We should have time together first to adjust to being husband and wife, but yes, someday." Hannah's smile was luminous. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding without my having to explain." Zachariah pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's what we do, isn't it? Understand each other, even in silence." Hannah nodded, settling more comfortably against him. "Yes, that's exactly what we do." The news of their engagement spread through Silveridge with predictable speed. Mrs. Green claimed credit for having seen it coming from the start, while Mrs. Winters sniffed disapprovingly about hasty decisions, but ultimately offered congratulations. Hannah's students were excited, especially when she assured them she would continue teaching through the end of the term. Pastor Miller agreed to perform the ceremony in the small church on the first Saturday in June. Hannah, with typical practicality, began making arrangements, immediately ordering fabric for a new dress, planning simple refreshments for after the ceremony, writing to old friends in Pennsylvania to share her news. Zachariah found himself caught up in her enthusiasm, making his own preparations at the ranch. He repainted the cabin inside and out, built new shelves for Hannah's books, and began construction on a small addition that would serve as a private bedroom, providing more space and privacy than the current one-room arrangement. Miguel, usually taciturn, expressed his approval in his own way, presenting Zachariah with a finely crafted bridle he'd made during the winter months. "For Miss Redmond's mare," he explained. "A wedding gift." May brought warm weather and the completion of most preparations. Hannah finished the school term, bid temporary farewell to her students, and moved her belongings from the boarding house to the ranch, though she maintained propriety by sleeping in Samuel's bed until the wedding. The addition to the cabin was completed just in time, a snug room with a larger bed than Zachariah's current one and windows that caught the morning sun. Hannah arranged her books on the new shelves, hung her sketches beside Zachariah's few pictures, and added touches that blended her possessions with his into a shared home. On the evening before their wedding, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Hannah's hand rested in Zachariah's, her engagement ring catching the fading light. "Are you nervous?" Zachariah asked, aware of his own mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Hannah considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "Not about marrying you, that feels absolutely right, but about living up to expectations." Zachariah understood she wasn't just referring to the physical aspects of marriage, though that was certainly part of it. She meant the broader expectations, being a rancher's wife, a stepmother to Samuel's memory, potentially a mother herself someday. "We'll figure it out together," he assured her, squeezing her hand. "Day by day," Hannah smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Yes, we will." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect June morning. Zachariah rode into town early, leaving Hannah to follow later with Miguel, who had proudly accepted the role of escorting her to the church. The small church was simply decorated with wildflowers gathered by Hannah's students. The pews were filled with townspeople, some genuine friends, others merely curious. Pastor Miller waited at the altar, his Bible open and a warm smile on his face. When Hannah appeared at the back of the church on Miguel's arm, Zachariah felt his breath catch. She wore a dress of pale blue, not the traditional white, but a color that brought out the gold in her hair and the warmth in her eyes. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that matched those decorating the church. As she walked toward him, Zachariah was struck by how far they had both come from that first meeting in the general store, two people bound by grief, finding in each other not an escape from pain but the strength to carry it together, to build something new alongside it. The ceremony was simple and brief. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and sure in the quiet church. When Pastor Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Zachariah kissed Hannah with a tenderness that belied the depth of his emotion. The celebration afterward was modest cake and punch in the church hall, congratulations from townsfolk, shy presents from Hannah's students. By mid-afternoon, they were riding back to the ranch, their home together. Mrs. Zimmerman, Zachariah said as they reached the property, testing the sound of it. Hannah smiled, her eyes bright with happiness. "I like it," she declared. "Though to the children at school I'll remain Miss Redmond, it will be less confusing." Zachariah nodded, understanding her practical reasoning. "Two names for your two worlds." "But the same person," Hannah assured him, "just with different hats." At the cabin, Zachariah insisted on carrying Hannah across the threshold, making her laugh with delight at the old-fashioned gesture. Inside, the home they had prepared together welcomed them, a fire laid ready in the hearth, Hannah's books mingling with Zachariah's on the shelves, the new bedroom waiting with fresh linens on the bed. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their room, Zachariah held Hannah close, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of his grief to this newfound joy, from isolation to connection, from silence to understanding, it seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking?" Hannah whispered, her head pillowed on his chest. "That I never expected to be happy again," Zachariah replied honestly. "After Samuel died, I thought that part of my life was over." Hannah raised herself on one elbow to look at him in the dim light. "And now," Zachariah touched her face gently, tracing the curve of her cheek. "Now I know that happiness doesn't replace grief. They exist side by side. Samuel will always be part of me, part of us, but there's room for joy too." Hannah nodded, understanding as she always did. "Life continues," she said softly, "and we continue with it, carrying our losses but not defined by them." "Exactly," Zachariah agreed, pulling her close again. As they drifted towards sleep, Zachariah thought of the journey they'd begun, not just the marriage, but the deeper path of building a life that honored the past while embracing the future. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, perhaps even more losses along the way. But they would face them together, with the quiet understanding they had found in each other. And in that understanding, there was hope that had seemed lost forever in the wake of Samuel's death, but had been reborn in the shared silence of two wounded souls finding their way back to life.